In this video, we're going to be replacing the inner tie rod end on this 2005 Honda Element. We're going to be replacing the passenger side. The process is going to be the same for the driver's side. It's going to be the same process as well for the 2003 through 2011 first generation. The first thing we're going to need to do is get down in here behind our motor. We're going to get to the inside of the inner tie rod. Now I'm holding the new one to show you. We're going to get right into this area here. There's actually a locking washer that's bent over that we're going to need to bend back to release the inside. So I'm going to do that with a long pry bar. And you want to be careful. Right above me here is our power steering pressure line. So here's the top of that bent over tab or washer. And I'm going to use a rubber mallet to see if I can get that tab to start bending upwards. So now we're using a long pry bar again, just trying to come in at a different angle to get underneath that washer. Just be careful of your surrounding hoses and pipes. So now from underneath the vehicle, we can see, and I'll use a long pry bar to point to it, we can see right up in here the lower tab on that washer that we have to bend outwards towards the passenger side. So we're aiming for this right here. Now we're going to come in with the long pry bar from our driver's side wheel well access just over our control arm. To remove our wheel, it's going to be a 19mm socket. I'll take our wheel off now. So we're going to go ahead and remove our passenger side wheel. It's going to be a 19mm socket. Now on the passenger side here with our wheel off, what we're going to do is remove our outer tie rod end. That's going to consist of a nut on the bottom and a jam nut in back. We're going to start with the jam nut in back. It's going to be a 24mm. So you'll notice that the tie rod end actually rotates a little bit, so I'm trying to get into a good position for the wrench. There we go. So we're only going to spin it back just a little bit. We're not going to loosen it all the way up. So we want it just off of the outer tie rod end. We want to be able to know how far in or out our tie rod is on the inner. So once we have the inner jam nut loosened up, we'll move down here. So our lock nut here is going to be a 19mm. What we're going to do is we're going to try it with an impact. There is a chance that the inner ball joint portion of your tie rod end will spin when you're trying to loosen up your nut. We're going to try it on the impact gun, see if we can shock it and get it to come down really fast without spinning the center. If the center spins, then we're going to have to lock it down with a hex bit. All right, so we'll go ahead and pop out our ball joint from our tie rod end. Sometimes you can hit right here on the outside to kind of shock and break these two free. You don't really want to be putting too much hammering on the end here. You do not want to ruin the threads. All right, so we got our ball joint of our tie rod end separated. Now what we're going to do is take the outer right off by spinning it. At this point, you want to count your rotations off. So we'll count a full rotation. We were started here. 1, 2, 3, and however many turns it takes to take it off. So we had 7. So now we have access to our inner tie rod. You can see here it goes all the way in. Pretty long. But unfortunately, we can't spin it out from here. There are a few flat spots here where you could put a wrench on it, but unfortunately we cannot because this whole piece spins inside a socket on the inside. So we're going to have to either tack this from the bottom or from the top. We'll lower the vehicle. We'll see what we can get done from the top. So before we get started, we're going to center our steering wheel. We're going to find our bolt that we need to get to, which is right in here, our 10mm bolt. And right in that area is going to be where your steering column connects to the power steering rack. It's going to be a geared tooth stub that sticks out of your power steering rack into your column. So before we do anything, we're going to take a yellow crayon and we're going to mark a line on our column and our steering column stub shaft so that when we put it back together, they line up in the same spot, which means our wheels should be straight while the steering wheel is straight. So we went ahead and made our mark on the column and the steering rack. So now we can go ahead and take out that 10mm bolt. So we have a couple of extensions and a swivel. The toughest part here is getting on the bolt. You have a little foam pad or a little insulation that's sticking out a little further than your firewall. So we're going to have to press that insulation down while we get on the bolt. So the first 2 bolts we're going to get to are holding on our power steering pressure line here. It's going to be one on this clamp, and there's going to be one towards the passenger side behind the other clamp. They're going to be 10mm. What we should also mention before we go any further is this line here. This line is typically sitting right in here. I just took it, moved it a little bit out of our way to give us a little bit more clearance. So if it looks like I have more room, that's why. So now we have that broken free. I'm going to move over to the other bolt. So now using a long extension, a swivel, we're able to get down to this 10mm bolt. So using that same extension and swivel, just go ahead and remove that 10mm bolt now. So now the next thing we're going to do is back out, or at least loosen, our pressure line from our power steering rack. So we're going to use a 9/16 on this right here. Now at this point, this is getting a little difficult to reach in. But if you can manage to get all this done while reaching through this area here, great. If not, if you feel like you want to, you can go ahead and remove your intake box. And that'll give you a little more clearance to move, but you don't have to. So this line here necessarily at this point does not need to come out all the way, but breaking it free sets you up, because the next thing we're going to do is the line directly above it with the band clamp on it. We're going to go ahead and remove that. So now our band clamp on our top line here, for us, this band clamp is an 8mm, yours might be different. So now with the long pair of needle nose pliers, we're going to come in between the brake booster and the intake, grab a hold of that hose, just give it a good spin, try and break it free. And then we'll, if we're here with the pliers, see if we can back it off. And you want to try not to squeeze the hose too much to do any damage. Just want to try and slide it backwards. So we've got it started. Now at this point, you're going to want to have a spill protection down of some sort. You may have some fluid pop out of here. Just be prepared for a little fluid. You are working with the power steering system. There you go. While we're here, what we're going to do is remove this band clamp so we don't lose it in there. And we'll set that aside. So now, right underneath the line we just removed, we have our pressure high line. I'll just go ahead and take that line out completely now. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and pop this line out, and we have an absorbent pad down here. We'll just pull it right out and let it drip right into that pad. So now to give ourselves a little bit more room, what we're going to do is reach in here and disconnect this electrical connection from our high pressure line. That'll allow us to take this line out and rest it on top of the motor. Give us just a little bit more room, and it won't get hung up as we take the steering rack out of the vehicle. So the last thing we need to do is break this line. All right, so plug is disconnected. Go ahead and work this line out. Now, just be aware there might be some residual fluid in this line, so we have a little drip pad here, just in case there is some fluid. So now we're going to remove this 10mm bolt holding this hose by a clamp. Now that hose, we're going to follow up and across. It's going to come up and across the power steering rack. There's a metal bracket that runs across the top of it. That hose is going to be clamped onto that bracket. So this hose here is the one we're talking about. This is going to go to our power steering reservoir. So this is going to stay in the vehicle. So the next thing we're going to do is follow this hose across. We're going to find this bracket, kind of hidden away. But if you do what I just did here and you grab that hose, and you kind of lift it up towards you and follow it across, you can find that bracket that holds that. We're going to have to undo or pop open that little clip, and then this hose should be free. So now again, we follow this hose forward, and we find this gray clip here. What we're going to do is just reach in and pry open that clip. I'm going to try a pick tool here. You can try a small pocket screwdriver. Be careful with the pick tool. Don't want to pop a hole in the line. All right, so we switched over to a small pocket flat blade screwdriver, just so we guarantee we don't do any damage with the pick tool. Just going to open up that clip. This hose here is a little bit in my way. I'm just going to move it. Okay, once you have that clip opened up, it's going to pop just like that. So you're going to have to pry the front of that clip open, pop up the top. Once you have that done, this hose here from your power steering line will be free. What we're going to do, just to keep the fluid in the line as much as possible, is bring this line up as high as we can get it and out of the way. So now, on the passenger side, we see the end cap of our power steering. This is the end cap of our power steering rack. If we follow this in slightly, you'll see one bolt sticking forward. If you look at that from the top side, it looks like a strap that goes around, and there's going to be a bolt on the top side here. I'm going to take out those two bolts. They're going to be 18 millimeters. And we're going to start with this bottom one. I'm going to come in through the passenger side wheel well. So we have here the entire stud, which means the nut was supposed to come off, but it took the entire stud out with it. Now, that's not entirely bad. It's just not the way it was supposed to come out. So at this point, you should be holding the nut and not the entire. So now we just removed the bottom bolt. There should be a stud on the bottom, but there isn't. But if you follow this all the way up and around your steering rack, you'll find the top bolt. It's going to be right inside this power steering hard line here. That again is going to be an 18 millimeter. And from the passenger side wheel well, we'll go ahead and loosen that one up. Now what you're doing here is removing or loosening a bracket that is clamping down this side of the rack. So be prepared for your rack to become just a little bit looser when you get these either off or coming out. All right, so we've just switched over to an electric tool here just to be a little bit quicker and easier on that bolt. There you have the top bolt. So now we're over to the driver's side, and this is where the rest of the action is going to take place. We're going to remove our outer tie rod end from our strut here, and then we have two bolts remaining on this side on our power steering rack. The first thing we're going to do is address our outer tie rod end, then we'll move on to the power steering rack. Once we have these two bolts free, we should be able to take our entire power steering rack and tie rods out through the driver's side. So now the first thing we're going to do is remove our cotter pin from our tie rod end here. We're going to bend back our cotter pin And these typically are one-time use. You want to try not to reuse these at all costs possible. If you can get in here with that pliers, go ahead and pull it out. So now our castle nut's going to be an 18 millimeter. We're going to use an impact. See if we can shock that to pop loose. So now we have our tie rod and ball joint here loose. What we're going to do is thread that castle nut back up until it's flush with the end. And we're going to try and get our ball joint out of the strut here. So sometimes you can come in with a hammer right on this arm, give it a few taps, and get that to loosen free. Sometimes, worst case scenario, you can hit straight up through here on the end of that ball joint, which is why we put the castle nut here flush with the end, so you're not mushrooming your threads. Again, that's worst case scenario. Hit it on the arm first. Now that we have that loose, go ahead and take our castle nut off, take our tie rod out of the strut. Now for us, we're going to put that castle nut right back on so we don't lose it. And we can set that tie rod end out of the way because we will be getting to a bolt here on the inside. Okay, so with a 17 millimeter socket, we'll start to remove these bolts. All right, so there's one, most of the way out. We'll loosen up the top one. We might switch a tool. So this looks like it was a bolt and a washer just rusted together. There we go. So now that we have our steering rack loose, what we need to do is separate it from the steering wheel, which I'll show you by using a pry bar, is up in this area here, right, going right through our firewall. So we have a stub or a rod coming out of our steering rack, going through the firewall. So we can't now just grab this rack and pull it straight out. It's going to have to drop down, forward, and then out. So I'm going to use this pry bar to see if we can just help maneuver it out and be very careful not to do any damage. There we go. Got it free from the column. So now is probably the hardest part of the entire job, is getting your entire steering rack, which runs the entire length of your dashboard, or actually all the way out to here, to come out this way. So it's a little awkward. It's definitely kind of long, and you have to maneuver it through the vehicle out this side. So take your time. Try not to do any damage to any lines. You do still have a couple of hard lines still attached. Do not want to damage them. So we're taking it out, forward, angled down, and then we're going to try and pull it to us. So we have the stub for our steering column here, which is the bigger problem of getting this out, is you have to maneuver that so it comes out. Okay, once you get to a certain point here, things are going to get a little tough. You may have to work from the other side to help push it out or align the back half of the other side. So we've gotten to a certain point where we can't pull anymore. We'll go to the other side and see what we can align. All right, so we're free and clear here. This will take some time of just finding that right angle, not the 90-degree one. So now we've gotten this far. You can see that we have a couple of loose tie rods here, so be careful when we actually lift this out. They are going to drop down unless you can get under here and hold them and support them while we move this, which might not be a bad idea. Whatever you do, don't hold this and support it by these hard lines. You don't want to bend or break them. Hold it from the bottom. We can take our power steering rack right out. So now our inner tie rod end here is connected to a block with a folded over washer. We've taken the whole assembly out of the vehicle. So now we have access to this area here, which is going to be 1 1/8 inches. Now ours has a little bit of corrosion on there, so we're going to have to tap our wrench down. Now we can go ahead and spin that inner tie rod right out. It's going to take a moment. There we go. So now on the inside edge of our inner tie rod, we have to put our new washer in place. You'll see it's cut in a hex form, which inside here there is what looks to be the end of a bolt. You're going to make sure that your washer is lined up with that when you thread it in. So now we'll take it and we will thread it in place. We're going to try and hold our washer in place by hand best we can. Now sometimes it's a little difficult to do this if your tie rod end isn't perfectly straight. I'll just take it and kind of give it a little roll. May or may not help. All right, so now we've got it spun on, tightened down by hand. We can come in with our 1 1/8 wrench, tighten this down. Again, just want to be very careful of these transmission lines on the top. Now the way this is designed, you'll only be able to get a 1/2 to 1/4 turn at a time here. because there's a bolt behind there. All right, once you've got this bottomed out, go ahead and give it another turn as much as you can. Once you've got this inner tie rod end tightened down the best you can, we'll bend these tabs over to lock it in place. So I think we're just about there. Got no more movement. Now we can come back and bend our tabs over. So now that we have our inner tie rod nice and tightened up, we're going to take our round washer here and pin it over onto this center block like you see on this would be the driver's side. So we're going to fold this over to match the other side. We're going to start with our hammer. So now we're going to take our power steering rack and put it back into the vehicle through the driver's side. So now this is going to be just as difficult as it was taking it out. You have a couple of brackets that are going to want to hold you up, and your steering linkage here, or your steering nub. Now the one thing you definitely want to be careful with while you're doing this is not to rip your boots on the rack, so be careful of that. Once you get it in far enough where you think you can go on the other side and reach it from there, you can go ahead and move around. You will be moving back and forth. The big thing here is to get this steering shaft from your rack into the firewall, into the engine bay. Then you're pretty much home free. Almost there. Hardest part's done. We have our steering shaft into this opening, into the engine bay. We are right now just trying to work it past our power brake booster. And we have a bolt mounting point here that's hanging down a little low. We have to get that in. And then you'll be able to tell if you're really close if your tie rod and ball joint is somewhat close to the strut. So we know we have to go in just a little bit more. So now what we're going to do is take our 2 bracket bolts for the driver's side, and we're going to put the driver's side of our rack in place and loosely bolt these in. All right, so our power steering rack isn't sitting in completely level. It's a little bit of an angle, so our bottom bolt won't line up. So in the meantime, what we're going to do is snug the top one up, but still allow the rack to rotate a little bit. We'll go over to the other side, and on the other side we'll put the other top bolt in, and from there we should be able to do the other side bottom bolt, and then come back over here and put this one in. All right, so we're going to install this bolt here. We're going to lift our rack into place, and we've put the bolt in our socket. All right, so if you guys remember, we took out the stud along with the nut on the bottom here, so we are reinstalling that assembly, the nut and stud assembly. All right, so we're just going to get this one snugged up, and we'll go back on the other side, on the driver's side. We'll put in that remaining last bolt, and then we'll torque them down. So now we're going to put in our bottom bolt here, our last bolt on the steering rack. It's still a little bit low, so we need to just push our rack up just a little bit. And we can snug that up. And we'll torque them all down. So now we're going to torque down our 4 bolts holding our power steering rack in place. All 4 bolts are going to get torqued down to 46 foot-pounds. Right from here, we'll just move right on top. And we'll do the same thing to the top bolt. So now we're going to reinstall our outer tie rod end. Now to do this, we're going to thread it on, and as soon as it gets started, we're going to start to count the number of full rotations. For us, that number is 7. For you, that number might be different. Let's go ahead and turn it in, that number of rotations. Once you have your outer tie rod end turned to that many rotations, we're going to go ahead and put it into our front suspension. On this specific vehicle, it's part of your strut assembly. All right, so I need to go one more so I can count the first half. And we can drop it right into place. Then we're going to take our nut. We're going to thread that on just to hold that in place. From here, we're going to take our lock nut in the back and tighten it up to the back side of the outer tie rod end. And then we'll come back and we'll tighten that up. So on our outer tie rod end here, we're going to use a 19 millimeter. We're just going to back up this tie rod from spinning too much, creating any unwanted damage. We're going to use a 21. Tighten down this jam nut. And we're going to tighten it down up to, and as tight as we can get it, up to the outer tie rod end. Just trying to spin this a little bit more accessible. Okay, once you have that tight, want to make sure that your tie rod end is level with the area that you're mounting it to. In this case, it's going to be this arm. We look like we're pretty good and level. We can come back here and we can start to tighten up our nut. Our new tie rod end is going to be a 19 millimeter. We're going to tighten this up. And something you want to take note of here is if you're going to use a socket, you want to make sure that it's actually tightening up, because there is a chance that the center will spin on you. So the center here may spin. Looks like we're tightening up pretty good. If you get to a certain point and the center spins, you're going to have to lock in the center with a hex bit and use a wrench here to tighten this down. So we'll get this snugged up. And then we'll torque it down. We're going to torque it down to 40 foot-pounds. This is a locking nut, so there will not be a castle nut on this side. So we're going to take our driver's side tie rod end now and put it into our strut. Press that down and put on this side, our castle nut. Now this side, because it's a castle nut, will take a cotter pin. If you did take off a castle nut with a cotter pin, go ahead and replace your cotter pin. We're going to tighten this down to 40 foot-pounds. And you're going to need to get the hole in the center to line up with the castle nut. To do that, you do not want to loosen the castle nut. You'll want to continue to tighten the castle nut to get the holes to line up. All right, so we have a hole here. We're on the edge of our castle nut, so we'll keep rotating, tightening. Right about there. Will allow us to take a new cotter pin, slide it through. I'm going to push it all the way in, grab this side, pull straight down. What I like to do here is just wrap it all the way around, and then with a hammer, tap up the inside edge, so if you continue to need to work in this area, you're a little bit less prone to cut yourself. So now we're going to reattach our power steering hose here. We have a clamp down the bottom side and a hose clamp here that you want to make sure is on. So when you go to reinstall this line, the first thing you want to do before you reinstall it is you want to make sure that this line is on the inside of your passenger side inner tie rod. So when you look down in the vehicle, you should see inner tie rod and then this line behind it. All right, so we have that in place. What we're going to do now is feed our hose up to the barb here, and we're just going to press it on. And then we're going to take our hose clamp, slide it into position. So now with a long extension coming in just over our air filter box or air filter housing, we can get on our hose clamp. Now our hose clamp is an 8 millimeter. Yours may have been replaced or it might be different. We'll tighten this down. All right, so now we follow this hose down. We have a little bracket that's going to bolt into our steering rack. So we're going to put our bolt in through the bracket. All right, so we've got it started. Now if you have any issues getting that bolt started in there, you can slightly pull your wheel open or pull your wheel out. It'll give you a little bit more room. All right. Now, up from there, so if we follow this power steering line that we just bolted in, up and over, you'll see 2 plastic clips on a metal bar. Now, I'll give you a little bit more access. We're going to pull this hose here out and down, and that plastic hose here behind it should have 2 plastic clips on it. There's one right here, which is actually broken, and there should be another one somewhere back here in this area. So we don't want to let this go with no clips holding it in place, so we're actually going to put a wire tie around that hose to at least give it some kind of support. A little trick with wire ties in an area like this where it's hard to get to. If you take your wire tie and pre-bend it, and then pre-bend it again, and then feed this through, it'll be easier to grab on the other side because it will be facing up. You just have to be able to grab it. Okay. So with those clips, you would just push the clips down and lock in the hose with this wire tie. I'm just going to pull one wire tie down tight on it. Okay. Come back and trim that tail. Anytime you're working with wire ties, try and trim that tail nice and flush and flat so it's not sharp. And then we can put this hose back in place. All right, so now we're going to put in our high pressure power steering line. Right here is a very important part. You're going to be able to bend this if you don't pay attention. So make sure you take caution with this side of the line as you feed it through and put it in position. So we're going to feed this down right into the rack area. We're almost going to ride right up against the rack. We're going to make sure we're behind these hoses here. We're going to pull it over and get it in the right area. The first thing we're going to do is line up and start to thread in our end. All right, so the first thing we're going to work on is threading in our end, because once we have that end in, everything else is easier. But if we do everything else first, like bolt this line down, putting that end in will be a little bit more difficult. All right, so we're going to line it up. So what we're going to actually do is make sure the end is free and clear of any debris. We're going to push that into position. I'm going to slide that fitting in and just start to thread it in by hand. We don't want to cross thread this. All right, so just go ahead and continue to work that in. Once you get it tight enough by hand, we'll come back with a wrench. So now the 14mm open-ended wrench, what we're going to do is tighten down that line. All right, once you've got your line tightened down, we can move back down that line and start to put in our bolts for our clamps. All right, so our first clamp. And there will be a little locking square tab next to the clamp. Just going to make sure that your bracket tab is in that little spot. I'll go ahead and put our bolt in. And if we follow that towards the passenger side a few inches, there'll be one more bracket or one more clamp. So again, we find our first clamp that we just put our bolt into. We're going to move back a few inches, find our next clamp. I'm going to rotate it around. Make sure that the tab is into the bracket. And we can start our bolt by hand. These bolts are going to be 10 millimeter. Now that we have them both started, we'll come back and tighten them down. Remember, if you move any hoses or anything out of the way, just remember to put them back when you're done. And then the last thing we're going to do on this line is come across and we can find our connection here, our electrical connection. We're going to need to plug that back in, which means we're going to have to find the plug, which should be back there. It's as simple as pushing it in. To give you a little bit more view, I'll remove this hose. This is what we're working on now. Just take this plug, and this is a line you do not want to forget to plug back in. Go push it until you hear that click confirmation. Put this hose back, and from here this hose will rest right in here. Now we need to put our steering column onto our steering rack. But to do that, we're going to need to loosen up this top bolt a little bit. It's going to be a 10 millimeter. We're not going to take it out, we're just going to loosen it up slightly. Alright, what that's going to allow us to do is slide this up just a little bit more. Might need to back it out just a touch more. We're just going to take this bolt out. So what we were looking for was, you can see it just dropped down. We were looking for it to move up. Okay, so put this back in just a thread or two, just so we don't drop that bolt. All right, so we don't want to spin this. We don't want to remove this U-joint here and move it into a new position. We just want to slide it up a little bit. Okay, so now it's moved up, which will now allow us to center our wheel if it's moved at all. We still have a little bit of our yellow crayon line here. You can barely see it on camera, but it's right there. So we're going to make sure our steering wheel is straight. We're going to make sure we've identified our mark here, our yellow mark. We're going to line it up on to the stub coming through the firewall from our rack. We're going to make sure the yellow marks align. And we're going to slide the collar, the U-joint, onto that stub coming out of the firewall. All right. Once we have that in place, we'll make sure, we'll triple check that our wheel is straight. If you need to, go ahead and double check that your wheels are straight. And we can start to tighten down our bolts. Now this top bolt here is going to be a little difficult in this position because there's a strut in the way here. So we're just going to make sure that bolt doesn't want to fall out. And then we'll go ahead and install the bottom bolt. Okay. So now that we have the bottom screw, or the bottom bolt on our U-joint here, we are able to now turn our wheel and get the top bolt tightened back down. We can center back up our wheel, and that's it. So now at this point we can go ahead and put our wheels back on. Once you've done that, you want to take your car and make sure you have a professional alignment performed. So now we can install our wheel. Sometimes when I'm having an issue centering or getting the wheel on nice and flat, I like to do a top nice and tight, push in, do a bottom nice and tight, and then rock back and forth till I get those two nice and tight. And that usually helps me get a wheel nice and flat. All right, now we can do the other ones. Come in here with our 19 millimeter. Just snug these up. All right, now to torque these down, we're going to have to put the vehicle on the ground so the wheel doesn't spin. Now that our vehicle's on the ground, we're going to torque our lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a crisscross pattern. And then sometimes, if you really feel the need to, you can run around a second time just to make sure. And that's it. Now at this point, you're going to want to take your vehicle down to a shop and have a professional alignment done. We can go ahead and start to fill up our power steering fluid, which means we're going to remove the cap, just a straight pull up. We can set our cap aside. Now this vehicle is going to take transmission fluid. You can see what looks to be red in there. It's going to be transmission fluid. Because we have an empty line now, we're going to fill all the way up to the top, and it's okay if you go slightly over because you're going to need to fill this line once the vehicle starts running. All right, so we have a funnel. We're going to pour in slowly until we get to that top line. All right, so now that we've filled our power steering fluid to the top line, you want to go ahead and start your vehicle, run it to idle, nice warm operating temperature, turn your wheels all the way to the left, all the way to the right, 3 or 4 times. What that's going to do is cycle this fluid into your empty lines and through your power steering pump. Once you've done that, go ahead and turn your vehicle off, come back out here to your reservoir. You may notice that you've used some fluid. At that point, if you have, go ahead and add fluid to this top line. Once you've done that, you're all set. Cap it back up.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.